Thank you very much, and first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and for the opportunity to have a bit of an exchange with you. I'm really impressed that after such a long week where you have been discussing Europe day and night almost, if I believe the stories, that you're still interested and that you still have a lot of energy for this final session. But let's admit it, these are extremely interesting times to study Europe, to follow Europe as an observer. Also, in my case, to work for Europe. Things are moving extremely fast. So that's a given. And you can look at Europe in several ways. The glass can be half full. Say, okay, it's not too bad. Can be half empty. For some people may be a bit disappointed in what the European Union is doing or is not doing or cannot do. But it's a question, I think, in one way or another, and probably also in your own research, that you are confronted with almost on a daily basis. How is the European Union doing? Is it successful? Is it not successful? That's a key question. And it's also a question that the President of the European Commission has to answer every year in September. Every year in September there is this so-called State of the Union. We are now preparing the next State of the Union for President von der Leyen in September. And that's a bit a wrap-up, basically an assessment, an evaluation of where the European Union stands. And I really invite you, it's not that long, to look on the website and to read those different State of the Unions. They're very interesting. Take, for example, the State of the Union of 2020. That was in the midst of the COVID crisis. So it started February, March, more or less, at least in Europe. And we had the State of the Union a couple of months later, September 2020. When you listen to Ursula von der Leyen back then, you may be a bit surprised because her State of the Union was extremely upbeat, extremely enthusiastic, very optimistic. This is the moment for Europe. That's what she said. The moment for Europe has come. This is the moment where the European Union can really decide in which direction it wants to go. Not because others tell us what to do, and this was a reference, I think there are some historians here, to the Marshall Plan, where basically after the Second World War, the United States, I would put it diplomatically, encouraged European countries to come together and to start the European integration process. We can make our choices, we can decide to cooperate closer, not because others tell us to do it, not because external events push us to do it, I'm still quoting von der Leyen, but because we want to do it, because it's our choice now. So the idea of some kind of autonomy for Europe is clearly there. And the basic message she gave is a European Union that should not run after the facts, that should not be reactive, but that should set its own agenda. Digital agenda, obviously, climate agenda, goes without saying. In this case, in this context, also the idea of the health union, so also our own health agenda. We should be setting our own agenda. So very upbeat tone. I would say this is the yes, we can moment of the European Union in her speech, September 2020. Last year, State of the Union, more or less the same message. Europe is passing the test. We are doing pretty well despite the major crisis. And there is, in her words, a strong soul in everything. It's a bit spiritual, maybe. A strong soul in everything the European Union does. So the idea of values. Now, if you compare those messages, 2020, 2021, with the previous State of the Unions, given by her predecessor, Juncker, completely different. If you look at the State of the Union of 2015, by the way, that's a migration crisis, so another crisis, very negative. Juncker was in the European Parliament in the plenary session basically saying, if I look at the European Union, there is not enough Europe in the Union, there is not enough Union in the Union. Very negative. And the next year, 2016, even more negative. You know what happened in 2016. Basically, the months after the Brexit referendum, almost an existential threat for the European Union. You say Europe is not doing well. We always talk about solidarity. Look at the treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, 16 times a reference to solidarity. We see it on paper, but we don't see it in practice. Very sober, negative message. 2017-18, a bit better because the economy was picking up. 2019, more or less the same, because you just had the European elections in May 2019, and what everybody was predicting, namely a huge, overwhelming victory by extreme rightist, Eurosceptic, populist parties, it didn't materialize. So you basically had, after those elections, a European Parliament that could function, that could do what it's supposed to do as a co-legislator. So slightly more optimistic. But if I look back at the past 10, 12 years that I spent in the European institutions, basically we went from one crisis to another one. I started, you mentioned that I was working in the cabinet of President Herman Van Rompuy. When I was working in the cabinet of the European President, we had the banking crisis, the financial crisis, which led to the economic crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. And we were hardly recovered. We had hardly recovered, and we had, as I mentioned, the migration crisis in 2015. And then afterwards, well, then we basically had Brexit, and then we had COVID, and it continues. Now we have Ukraine and Russia. So why, in the midst of so many crises, do I write a book? Does Ursula von der Leyen say that there is some good coming out of these crises? And this is a bit the basic message of my book. Is it just political spinning? We want to be very pro-European, and this is what we have to say. We have to convince young generation that everything is going right, that everything is going well. Is it a personality? Maybe we are eternal optimists. Or is it something different? Could it be that every crisis is a unique opportunity for the European Union to reinvent itself and to strengthen itself? I believe it is. And in my book, I explain a bit how that mechanism actually works. And the book talks mainly about the COVID crisis, but I'm also happy, of course, to discuss any other crisis that comes after that. So it is important to see how Europe reacted to that COVID crisis. Usually, I talk about 4 different stages. Actually, if you look at that period, it is a real roller coaster. The period from the outbreak of the COVID crisis till, let's say, right now, a real roller coaster. Sometimes you had ups, sometimes you had downs, sometimes things were incredibly slow, sometimes things were accelerating, speeding up, that you hardly could follow the decision making. A real roller coaster with 4 stages. The first one, in the very beginning of this crisis, let's say January, February 2020, the early months, I call it confident inaction. Stage, a reaction of Europe as confident inaction. European Union was pretty confident back then. Don't panic. Everything is under control. There is something happening in China. It may spread to some other countries in the region, but we will not be affected. And this confidence led to inaction. Europe was doing a couple of things. They were repatriating European citizens from the region in China and around China, starting with the Wuhan province and so on. So repatriation, okay. But it wasn't really seen as a health crisis. And there are several reasons for that. When you dig a bit deeper, why that actually is the case, first of all, because it was really considered as a problem limited to China. All the infections here in Europe, the very few infections that we had in the beginning, in one way or another had a link with China. People who had been traveling to China or who had close contact with Chinese citizens. So they say, okay, we can still contain it. The second reason, which is a bit linked to that, I would say, is that you always fight the previous battle. That's if you know a bit about military history, you're always fighting the previous war. And exactly the same was happening here. The previous wars in, let's say, the health context or the virus context were the SARS virus in 2002. 774 people died because of SARS. 1 European. Later on in 2012, we had the Mexican flu or the swine flu. Almost 900 people died, 0 Europeans. So this is also important to understand. And it's true that in 2009, we had another outbreak. of a deadly virus, I would say. 2,900 people died in Europe, but in the end it was less dramatic than everybody had predicted. And what was happening then is that those politicians who were massively buying vaccines were afterwards criticized also by the European Parliament. You're listening too much to the pharmaceutical lobby. We didn't need those vaccines. So the politicians, one of the conclusions of the politicians back then is, it's very dangerous for your career if you don't do enough, but it can also be very dangerous if you do too much. So also, I think a bit of empathy in the mindset of the people who saw the first infections coming in towards the European Union is, let's be cautious. But the more fundamental reason, I think this is more interesting for you, has to do with the competence of the European Union. It's incredibly important to know very well, based on the EU treaty, what the European Union can do and what it cannot do. In the case of health, it's very clear. You have the famous Article 168, which defines the competences of the European Union in the health area. And basically, the European Union can do quite a lot. They can make recommendations, the Commission can make recommendations, they can coordinate, they can exchange best practices, but they cannot decide. Decisions are taken by the member states. And this is also one of the complications in the beginning of this health crisis. You shouldn't, I mean, it's more nuanced than that, because it doesn't mean that the European Union doesn't have any competences at all. We have a lot of legislation on the internal market, which means that if you produce a medicine in country A, because of the internal market, it can easily be transported to country B, so you need some common standards. So because of the internal market legislation that we have, we also can have an impact on health policy. For example, the production of medicines. We have a lot of environmental legislation on air pollution, for example. There is a link with health. We have a lot of social legislation on, for example, safety on the work floor, linked with health. But more fundamentally, there is that limitation. And of course, the reason is very simple. Member states want to keep that for themselves. It's a bit the same discussion that you have on defense. Usually it has to do with what goes to the heart of your sovereignty, but also to money. Social security, if you look at the national budgets, social security, it's a big part of your national budget. You don't want the European Union to decide too much about social security issues. So that was one of the limitations. What we at the same time also see is that through every crisis, you can stretch the legislation just a bit, and you can increase your competences. And this is what happened very frequently. I referred to the SARS crisis in 2002. At that moment, the European Union decided to create a ECDC. Normally, if I have students that are a bit older, they say, ECDC, rock band. When I talk to younger people, they say, what is this guy talking about? But it's a European Center for Controlled Disease. If you watch American movies and you see a biological warfare, you see those guys with CDC. That's basically the source of inspiration for the European Union. The Center for Disease Control in the US, even though it was not explicitly a mandate, back in 2002-03, the European Union created its own CDC. Right, with 290 people versus 12,000 people in the US, and I won't even make the comparison with the budget. And also, this is a center that works with data. But as I explained before, data are in the hands of the membership, of the member states. So they decide which kind of data they share according to their criteria. This is one of the things that happened, you may remember, in the beginning of the crisis. Some people defined an infection in a different way than other member states. So how can you be very operational if you don't really have the data? And one of the most striking examples, I think, is when early on, in January already, the European Commission, the Commission for Health, basically said, we have to, this is serious, this can be serious. The ministers have to discuss this. But you have the Commission and you have the Council with the ministers. And it's not the Commission that can convene a Council meeting. It's the President of the Council that has to do that. In that case, it was Croatia. And Croatia said, not yet. So you see to what extent you have a lot of limitations that altogether explain, for good or for bad, why the reaction was rather slow. Confident in action. Of course, Fast forward to the end of February, explosion, and I think you all remember the dramatic images from especially northern Italy towards late February, early March, an explosion of the infections. Second phase, European Union moved from inaction, confident inaction, no panic, to selfish improvisation. Second stage. Improvisation because they said, well, we don't have face masks. We don't know what happened to our stocks with face masks. We used to have them years ago, but now, I mean, they've been destroyed. We don't have them. We don't have enough beds on the intensive cares. We are not so prepared as we really thought. And the reaction of that was, you start to improvise. One member state after another started to improvise. I will close my borders. That's the best solution. I will make sure that my citizens cannot travel to northern Italy. But if you live in another country, you could travel to northern Italy. You cannot travel to China, another country said. Another country said, I will keep the borders open. We block the trucks at the frontier. So a lot of unorganized, uncoordinated initiatives by member states. And this is really very interesting to see, because it didn't last long before the member states realized that it's not so easy. And I had seen exactly the same in the banking crisis. Remember that the Greek banks were on the verge of collapse. Some member states said, let them collapse. I mean, these are Greek banks, not our banks. Till they realized that if the Greek banks start falling, because the banking sector is so much integrated in the European Union, it will also affect the German banks, the Belgian banks, and so on. So we were forced to also save the Greek banks in order to save the euro. Exactly the same mechanism, and I call it enlightened self-interest. Basically, the realization that your own interest is best served by the common interest in the European Union because everything is so integrated. Go back to the example of the COVID crisis. If you block the borders and you have, I won't mention specific countries, but you have certain countries whose citizens are massively working abroad, just across the border. Those people, if you close the borders, yeah, they lose their job. So it becomes a bit of a political problem for yourself as well. Trucks that are stuck, it also affects your own warehouses. Some countries were really relying on seasonal workers, in the fruit sector, for example. If those seasonal workers cannot leave their country, I mean, you also create problems for other countries. So at one point, and it didn't last very long, I have to say, mid-March, the idea was very prominent, like we're all in this together. And I've seen this many times before in European history, starting with the banking crisis. And then, of course, the dynamic changes. Once the member states realize that we have to find a common European solution, they do something very interesting. Usually they say, now we have to act, which means they sent it to the European Council. 10th of March, the first time that the European Council are the prime ministers, as you probably know, the prime ministers and the heads of state, who for the first time discussed the COVID crisis. In other words, it became Chefsache. And this is one of the most interesting concepts in European integration, I think, Chefsache. Nobody knows what it is. But at one point, I mean, it's not in any treaty. It's not defined. There is no agreement on what is Chefsache. But when a topic becomes Chefsache, it ends up at the agenda of the European Council. This is good and bad. And I was very much confronted with it myself when I was working for the European Council, because some people immediately say, yeah, this is so important, it's Chefsache, so please put it on the agenda and have the ministers discuss this. Others say, no. We keep it at the level of the ministers or the COREPER, but we don't want to have a discussion on that in the European Council. Why? The advantage of the European Council is that it can give an enormous push. You have some shortcuts, basically. You don't have all those technical discussions anymore, because if the prime ministers agree and the presidents agree on something, I mean, as a simple diplomat, you're not going to say, sorry, but I don't agree. We will simply say, your prime ministers agreed it, so shut up. But the disadvantage is that the European Council works with unanimity. So every single country has a veto right. While in most of the processes that we have in the European Union, we have qualified majority. It's much easier to have a solution with qualified majority. When you send the topic to the European Council, you basically shift the topic from qualified majority to unanimity. Makes it much more difficult to reach a consensus. But in this case, it worked very well. When you look at March, the European Council gave a big boost. Things started to move. The trucks that were blocked at the borders, well, we will invent green lanes. We will make sure that there are different lanes that allow the truck drivers basically to cross the border without too many problems. Seasonal workers, we give you a quick pass. You can pass, no problem, problem solved. We will give massive socio-economic support for those companies that, because of the lockdown, had to close down. You lose your job, temporary support. Here it is. We will coordinate our positions on travel advices. No, it cannot be the case that you, Spain, and you, Germany, do your own thing. We will coordinate. We will come together. Big push from the top. And then basically you were in the stage of the crisis management. Third stage. Things started to move, crisis management. But of course, crisis management, by definition, it's short term. You also had to find a way out for the longer term. And that's the fourth phase that started, for me, the symbolic date. And please stop me, because if I'm talking too long, stop me, because I can go on forever. The fourth phase, 18th of May. Incredibly important date. Maybe some of you still remember the bit awkward press conference with 2 video screens. You had Merkel and Macron, who basically announced a new initiative. They say, okay, we need a fund, 500 billion. Just to give you an idea of the volume, the whole 7-year budget of the European Union is 1,100 billion. So 500 is quite a lot of money. Germany and France, they suddenly came forward and they said, we're going to create a fund of 500 billion. Great applause, fantastic, a lot of money. But that's not what was interesting about this fund. This fund did something that was completely new in the European Union and was never seen before. For the first time, the European Union, as a union, could go to the market and lend and borrow money on the financial markets. This was not the case before. I've been there for many, many years. We tried to create some kind of budget and give the European Union the competence to issue bonds. I don't want to be too technical, but issue bonds on the financial market and then get the money and borrow as a European Union. Every member state had to do it separately. You can go as a member state, you can go to the financial market and say, okay, I issue a government bond, sovereign bond, and I get money and I will pay it back. For Germany and the Netherlands and some others who are economically doing quite well, this is easy. They don't pay any interests, any interests. But for other countries, this is almost impossible to do. If you have a very high debt, the markets are going to say, oh, we're not so keen on lending you money. So basically for those countries, it was really problematic, if possible at all, to go to the financial market. So you now have a European solution whereby the European Union, which has an excellent credit rating because of certain member states, goes to the market, gets the money, and channels the money towards the countries that need it most. This is a very strong signal of solidarity. And we, as I mentioned, we had this discussion for years in the European Union. It was always blocked. Suddenly, with COVID, it was possible, and we had this new mechanism. Then, of course, the European Commission jumped on it. Again, this is a side thought, but when France and Germany managed to come together, it can also give an important boost to certain European projects. So they prepared the ground. The European Commission took the 500 billion, basically the idea of the 500 billion, added another 250 billion, and there we have our long-term recovery project, our long-term recovery fund called Next Generation EU. Completely new instrument, strongly conditioned. This money can only be used for the economy of the future. You cannot put that money in projects that are for the old economy. Very concrete, if you want to use this money as a member state, you have to make sure that at least 37% goes to climate-friendly policies and at least 20% goes to digital policies. So this was the whole idea. So these are just a couple of examples that I give of new initiatives that were basically given a boost by the COVID-19 crisis. And I believe make the case for, allow us to say that, okay, every crisis is a new opportunity to do new things. If you look, for example, at the ECDC, it's now completely transformed in HERA, we call it. It's a completely new authority that has much more power than its predecessor. So if I briefly look at what are the lessons that we can learn from this crisis and that are applicable to what we have now, I would say, if you allow me, 5 lessons. First lesson, Europe has had, we can discuss about that, a problem with short-term crisis management. I gave the example, in a panic at one moment, everybody taking its own decisions. Short-term management and long-term foresight. Why do I say short-term crisis management? It's not normal that the Schengen acquis, the Schengen construction, was just put in the freezer just like that. It's not normal. It's not normal that we don't have any reserves of protective medical equipment. It's not normal that some countries are just left alone by themselves, in this case, Italy. So there was a problem with crisis management, and I think to some extent Europe has found a solution for that. But there was also a problem with longer-term foresight, foreseeing the problems, and this is extremely important for academics and for people who are working on their PhD, because we need that intelligence as well. You can only be prepared if you know what's coming. If you fail to prepare, you're prepared to fail. That's a given. Now, for my book, I did some research and I say, was this really unexpected, this COVID crisis? Could we have seen it coming? I was shocked by the publications that really predicted in much detail what could happen. Not only the kind of virus, not only where it would originate, not only how it could originate, not only how it would spread, everything was there. Everything was in the academic literature. Politicians kind of knew it, of course, but it was not integrated, and this is only one example, and it goes for many other areas as well. It was not integrated in the decision-making process. What we are doing now in the Commission, for every initiative that we take, we ask, and there is a vice president responsible for that, for foresight. It's a new innovation, I would say. We ask that his services, the Commission services, also add an annex, a document on foresight. So we try to integrate it in our decision-making. Baby steps maybe, but it's going in the right direction. So first important lesson, work on crisis management, but also include academic research, also include foresight. Second lesson from the COVID crisis, I think that's an open door. We learned how dependent we are. How dependent we are from China for face masks, to give that example, from India for medicines, also from the US. Now we are here in a physical setting, but during the lockdown we were using Zoom, WebEx, you name it, all American technology. If you look at the list of the top technology firms, not a lot of European companies. This makes us extremely dependent. And so this is where the idea of strategic autonomy comes in. Strategic autonomy that some politicians started to discuss it at the European level in 2016, 17 a bit. Merkel played with the idea. Macron very much was playing with the idea of strategic autonomy. But it really became very prominent as a concept after the COVID crisis. Now, what does it mean? It means that certain products, we have to be able to produce them in Europe themselves. And if the production of certain products has left Europe, we have to make sure that the production comes back to Europe. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Does it mean that to protect our interests, we have to become protectionists? That we have to produce everything in Europe and close our borders? Not at all. That's why we also sometimes talk about open strategic autonomy. And you need very good PhD students to explain what it actually means in reality, but anyway. So it is a fine line between making sure that you protect your own strategic interests and still having an open view on the global system. So there are certain strategic assets that you have to keep in Europe. I don't have to explain how this message was even reinforced by the Ukrainian-Russian war, by the Russian invasion in Ukraine. It showed how dependent we are, not on face masks and medicines, but how dependent we are for our energy on one supplier. Actually, 90% of the energy that we consume in Europe is important, 90%. 97% of the oil that we use is important. 40% of the gas comes from Russia. 27% of the oil comes from Russia. 46% of the coal comes from Russia. So this dependency, energy dependency, it's not new. In my previous job, 2014, when I was working with Šefčovič on the Energy Union, we were talking about this topic. But it didn't mean that we could make a lot of progress. Now we have, of course, in record time, I have to say, because the beginning of the war was in March, and in May 18, we presented Repower EU. I don't know if you are familiar with this Repower EU concept, but basically there the ambition, and it's more than an ambition because we have very concrete measures, is to become totally independent of Russian gas by 2027. And 3/4 of our dependency should be reduced by the end of this year. And on top of that, we managed to have sanctions in place that basically get rid of coal, get rid of oil. Not so easy, but we got them. Because of the idea of enlightened self-interest again. This time it was different than at the beginning of the COVID crisis. Here immediately, for a couple of days, you had the reactions of some member states who say, this is becoming problematic, so we have to conclude a deal. I'm not going to name the member state. I'm going to conclude a deal with Qatar to make sure that at least I have my energy resources safe. Exactly the same selfish reaction that we saw in the beginning of the COVID crisis. It lasted for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, and then Europe came together and they say, some sanctions will be more painful for others, we know, but we need this solidarity. And we will find a mechanism of solidarity to make sure that the next winter, nobody will be in the cold. So second lesson, dependency, and I will speed up a bit now. Third lesson, yes, this can also come back in a discussion, I think. The importance of our European way of life, European values. If you look at how we handled the COVID crisis, it's very different from how, for example, the COVID crisis was dealt with in China. The European values of privacy, for example, you may remember the whole discussion on the app. In our case, it was mostly a voluntary app. Long discussions on how this would be aligned with GDPR rules, for example. The importance of at least our democratic institutions, the fundamental freedoms. There was a state of an emergency in some countries. The European reaction was very strong against that, and it was really a temporary measure. So this, I think, became much more important as a topic now, the European way of doing things. It's also a very difficult topic, to be honest, because you could argue that this was a very strong element of Europe's soft power. Is it still the case? I mean, democracies may become less popular if you look at the worldwide evolution. It's a fundamental question mark, but I think COVID showed that our European way of life is important, that we attach quite a lot of importance to it. The fourth lesson, let's look at our economic policy, the economic instruments that we have. Europe is famous for its state aid rules, so you cannot just give as a government unlimited resources to certain companies. It wouldn't be fair because you have countries with big pockets who have a lot of money and can support their companies, but this would be to the disadvantage of countries that cannot support their government. So we have a very good system in place of state aid rules. We have a very good system in place of budgetary rules and fiscal rules, the Growth and Stability Pact. And you know the rules, 60% maximum of national debt, 3% maximum of your deficit. In COVID times, these rules were suspended. So basically countries could spend money to help their companies. Countries could invest more. The disadvantage, of course, is that you see that national debt is going much higher, and now we have the whole problem with increase of, at one point you have to repay those debts. So it won't be that easy, but this is also a discussion to what extent, and I was having a pre-discussion here and I found it very interesting that in the UK, somebody told me, in the UK the perception was very much of the neoliberal Europe, where the market can do its thing, especially from the left side. This was very much criticized also. Now you have a tendency to have much more interventionist role of the government This is ongoing. We still need to have this discussion in Europe. We would have had it if it hadn't been for the crisis in Ukraine, but we will at one point need to have a discussion on what are we going to do with the state aid rules, so what are we going to do with the Growth and Stability Pact. And then the fifth and final lesson, I think, and that is very close to my personal interests. I'm also interested in all the other things I discussed, of course, but this is the role of climate change, environment. If there is one lesson to learn from COVID is that, of course, it's a health crisis, goes without saying, and it's a health crisis that became, to some extent, also a social and economic crisis. But first and foremost, it's an environmental crisis. It has to do with deforestation, how we treat nature, how we make sure that viruses such as this virus do not spill over from animals to human beings. So it is fundamentally an environmental crisis. The first reaction back then of some leaders in the European Union say, okay, climate policies, environmental policies, we are big fans. But now it's not the moment to do it. We are faced with a health crisis, we are faced with an economic crisis. Let's put our climate policies in the fridge for some time, and let's focus on economic recovery. This is not a choice that was made by the European Commission. They say economic recovery should go hand in hand with our climate policies. And that's why we came up with the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, but also with the famous Fit for 55 package that we are now negotiating with Parliament and the Council. Rather ambitious, that should have been negotiated, I think, will probably be negotiated by the end of this year. And then we had that other crisis again, Russia, Ukraine, energy prices going up, gas becoming extremely expensive. Some people saying like, well, it's a bit unrealistic that we cannot use our coal reserves right now, also in this country. So you have some countries who say, again, let's put this climate agenda a bit on hold, because now we have to solve this particular issue, the high, unaffordable energy prices. We'll see what the outcome is. I'm pretty confident that, as we saw in the past, the reaction will be, again, we have to speed up our climate policies, because one of the reasons why we are in this problem is that we are so dependent on fossil fuels. And in Repower EU, you see that the proposals we made as a Commission on Fit for 55, the ambition goes up. Not 40% of our energy should be renewable, 45% should be renewable. We shouldn't save energy 9% more, but 13% more. So more ambition on our climate agenda. And this will be incredibly difficult discussion, I think, because you have a lot of people in society who are struggling with the energy prices. You have a lot of politicians who are very sensitive to that. But I think, if I can make a prediction, is that we will come to the same conclusion again. We have to pursue our Green Deal agenda. So is all of this perfect? No, not at all. There are a lot of issues also in the construction of the European Union right now that we have to solve. There will always be a lot of work on the European Union. It will never be finished. Work will continue, and once you think that you can focus on some issue, there is another crisis that comes up. This will not be the last crisis. And we know, let's be honest, we know the next crisis. The next crisis will be the climate crisis. It's a given. So let's not deny that we didn't know it. But I can only start with what I said in the beginning. This is also an enormous opportunity for you who are preparing PhDs on issues that are of European interest. So I would encourage you to continue to follow what is happening and maybe also to engage. I can only tell you that being part of the European decision-making, it's incredibly interesting, it's very motivating. I wouldn't go back to academics. Thank you very much.